By the 11th century, Europe had changed so much that the very atmosphere of the time seemed to be pushing for something grand. By this point, the medieval Christian kingdoms were gradually emerging from the dark period of the early Middle Ages. The population was growing, cities were coming to life, and agriculture was yielding more and more crops thanks to new methods of land cultivation and the introduction of the heavy plow. People began to travel more often, establish trade, and universities, and the first seeds of future science appeared. But along with the growth of the population, competition for resources also intensified. There was not enough land in Europe, and many younger sons of knights were left without an inheritance. They needed to find a use for their swords and ambitions. The religious factor played no less a role. Christian Europe was deeply religious. Faith determined lifestyle, thinking, and politics. The idea of pilgrimage to holy places was one of the mainstays of spiritual life. For a devout Christian, touching the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem was considered the highest blessing. But the pilgrim's route lay through lands ruled by Muslims. At first, Christians and Muslims found compromises, but with the arrival of new dynasties, the situation became more complicated. It became particularly tense when the Seljuks began to expand their power in the Middle East, pushing back the Byzantines and threatening the pilgrims themselves. Politics also pushed Europe towards the Crusades. The once powerful Byzantine Empire was in crisis. The loss of Anatolia after the Battle of Manzikert, 1071, brought it to the brink of disaster. The Byzantine emperors turned to the West for help. For Pope Urban II, this was an opportunity not only to help Eastern Christians, but also to strengthen the power of the papacy by uniting all of Europe under its spiritual banner. Economic reasons were also significant. Italy, especially the cities of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, already dreamed of controlling the trade routes of the East. Eastern spices, silk, jewels, and medicines were highly valued in European markets. The Crusades promised not only spiritual rewards but also very earthly riches. Finally, the ideology of war for the sake of faith, the Holy War, was part of the medieval worldview. Europe saw Islam not simply as a different religion, but as a rival opposing Christianity. Therefore, the idea of liberating the Holy Land was met with enthusiasm. In November 1095, in the French city of Clermont, Pope Urban II delivered a sermon that went down in history. He called on Western Christians to go on a crusade to liberate the Holy Land from the wicked and come to the aid of their brothers in faith in the East. His speech ignited hearts. Contemporaries wrote that the crowd shouted, "Deus vult," God wills it. These words became the motto of the Crusaders. The first to respond were not kings, but ordinary knights and even peasants. In 1096, the so-called People's Crusades began. Crowds of unarmed or poorly armed people, led by preachers, rushed to the east. Many of them fell victim to hunger, disease, or hostile populations. Some of the Crusaders were defeated by the Turks in Asia Minor. But the very fact that thousands of people rose up for the sake of an idea demonstrated the power of religious fervor. The main forces of the First Crusade consisted of knights from France, Normandy, Flanders, southern Italy, and the German lands. Gautier de Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, and others became famous leaders. They were united by their desire for glory, faith, and wealth. The Crusaders' journey was difficult. The Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus greeted them with caution. He had expected small detachments, but tens of thousands of armed men approached his capital. He agreed to help them cross the Bosphorus, but demanded an oath of vassalage so that the conquered lands would formally return to Byzantine rule. The crusade began with victories. In 1097, after a heavy siege, the city of Nicaea fell. Then the Crusaders won the Battle of Dorylaeum, and in 1098, after long suffering, they took Antioch. This was one of the key battles. The city held out for a long time, and hunger nearly destroyed the Crusaders. But luck and faith helped. The chronicles say that the Holy Lance was found in Antioch, a relic which, according to the monk Peter, pierced the body of Christ on the cross. For the exhausted warriors, this was a miracle that lifted their spirits. Finally, in June 1099, the Crusaders approached the walls of Jerusalem. The city was under the rule of the Egyptian Fatimids. The besieged resisted stubbornly, but in July the Crusaders broke into the city. The chronicles describe a massacre. Thousands of residents, Muslims and Jews, were killed. For contemporaries, this was the fulfillment of God's will. Jerusalem had been cleansed. After their victory, the Crusaders established new states in the Holy Land: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. Their rulers were knightly leaders. Goffredo di Ivrea refused to bear the title of king in the city where Christ wore the crown of thorns, and accepted the title of defender of the Holy Sepulchre. After his death, power passed to his brother Baldwin, who had already become king. The creation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was a triumph. Europe celebrated the victory, the papacy strengthened its influence, and the knights established new possessions. But decades of struggle lay ahead, because the Muslim world soon began its counteroffensive. The First Crusade made a stunning impression in Europe. Pilgrims and knights had indeed created Christian states in the East, but holding on to them proved much more difficult. These lands were surrounded by enemies, dependent on European aid, and constantly short of people and resources. The reason for this was the fall of the County of Edessa, the first of the Crusader states to be established. The news shook Europe. For the first time, Christian possessions in the East were beginning to shrink. Two monarchs responded to Pope Eugene III's call: King Louis VII of France and German Emperor Conrad III. It was the first crusade led by kings. However, it was unsuccessful. The German army was defeated in Asia Minor, and the French army reached Syria, but the siege of Damascus ended in failure. The Second Crusade showed that it had become more difficult to fight the Muslim rulers, who by that time had begun to unite. The most famous of the Crusades is associated with the names of Richard the Lionheart, King of England, Philip II Augustus, King of France, and Frederick Barbarossa, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The reason for this was the fall of Jerusalem in 1187. This was made possible by the great Muslim commander Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, who managed to unite the Muslims and inflict a crushing defeat on the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin. The campaign was large-scale. Frederick Barbarossa died on his way to Asia Minor, but the armies of England and France reached the Holy Land. Richard the Lionheart proved himself to be a talented military leader. He won the victory at Arsuf, recapturing Jaffa and securing the coast. However, They failed to recapture Jerusalem itself. As a result, a peace treaty was concluded with Saladin. Christians were granted the right to make pilgrimages to the Holy City, but it remained under Muslim rule. It became the most scandalous. Initially, its target was Egypt, the richest Muslim country, but Venetian merchants intervened. The crusade was directed at Constantinople. In 1204, the Crusaders stormed the capital of Byzantium and looted it. Thus, the Latin Empire arose in place of the Great Empire. For the Christian world, this was a tragedy. The Eastern and Western churches became enemies, and the Byzantines never fully recovered. Later expeditions. There were other expeditions. The Fifth Crusade against Egypt, the Crusade of Frederick II, who managed to temporarily return Jerusalem through diplomacy, and the Seventh and Eighth Crusades of the French king Louis IX the Saint. But none of them yielded decisive results. By the 14th century, the Crusader states in the East had fallen completely. The last stronghold was the port of Acre, taken by the Mamluks in 1291. Knights' orders, spiritual and knightly orders, played a special role in the Crusades. These were brotherhoods that combined monastic vows with military service. The Templars, Order of the Temple, were created to protect pilgrims on the roads to Jerusalem. They soon became the richest organization in Europe, receiving land and donations. Their discipline and military strength made them a formidable force. The Hospitallers, Knights of St. John, began as monks who cared for the sick in Jerusalem, but gradually became a military order. They were known for their fortitude and later established themselves in Rhodes and then Malta. The Teutonic Order was initially active in Palestine, but later moved its operations to the Baltic region, where it expanded against the pagans. These orders became symbols of the Crusader movement, combining religious ideas with military organization. After the First Crusade, new political entities appeared in the East: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the County of Edessa. These lands are often referred to as the Crusader States or the Latin East. They existed for almost 2 centuries and were a unique experience of coexistence between the East and the West. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was essentially a feudal monarchy, similar to the states of Western Europe. The king was considered the supreme ruler, but real decisions were made jointly with the major vassals, the barons. They formed the High Council, which decided on matters of war, succession, and foreign policy. The feudal hierarchy was familiar to Europeans. Knights received land for their service, and peasants worked on it. But the local inhabitants, Muslims and Christians of the Eastern churches, also remained in their places. They constituted the majority of the population. The Crusaders did not destroy local communities. Muslims were allowed to live in villages, pay taxes, and keep their religion, although their rights were limited. The main cities of the East, Jerusalem, Acre, Tripoli, Antioch, became centers of trade. Not only knights lived there, but also merchants, craftsmen, and priests. People from Europe, especially Italians, flocked here. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa were given special quarters, warehouses, and harbors, which allowed them to control a significant part of Eastern trade. Spices, silk, sugar, glass, and other goods that were rare and luxurious in the West were brought to Europe through the Crusader cities. In return, they brought metal, weapons, cloth, and wine. Acre became a real crossroads of cultures, where you could meet people from France, Syria, Armenia, Greece, and even more distant countries. Life in the East was very different from that in Europe. The Crusaders had to get used to the hot climate, new types of food and clothing. Chronicles say that the knights quickly adopted local customs. They began to wear light fabrics and build houses in the Eastern style with courtyards and fountains. The Crusader states became a place of cultural exchange. Here, Arab medicine and European scholasticism, Muslim architecture and Gothic churches met. Majestic cathedrals were built in Jerusalem and Acre, but next to them stood mosques and oriental markets. Despite the wealth of the cities, the life of the Crusaders remained dangerous. Almost every spring or autumn, they expected attacks from Muslim armies. Castles and fortresses were the main symbols of the Latin East. One of the most famous was Crac des Chevaliers in Syria, a giant fortress held by the Hospitallers. Knights had to be constantly ready for war. Even religious orders lived by strict rules. Prayer and military service were their daily duties. Relations with the Muslims and Christians of the East were complex. On the one hand, they were enemies. On the other, they were neighbors and trading partners. Temporary truces and treaties were often concluded. Many crusaders even knew Arabic, hired local doctors, and used Eastern military techniques. Thus, for almost 2 centuries, a special world existed in Palestine and Syria, the Latin East, where the traditions of Europe and the Muslim East intertwined. The Crusades left a deep mark not only on the Holy Land, but also on Europe. Their consequences were felt in politics, economics, culture, and even science. One of the most noticeable effects was the development of trade. Contacts with the East introduced Europeans to new goods, spices, silk, jewelry, sugar, rare fabrics, and medicines. Italian cities, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, became centers for the shipment of these goods to Europe. New financial institutions emerged. Banking houses provided loans to the Crusaders, ensuring the payment of their expeditions and the purchase of goods. The Crusades also stimulated the growth of cities in the West. New craft and trade guilds appeared, and navigation and shipbuilding developed. Europe gradually transitioned from a closed feudal economy to an open economic space. Contact with the Muslim East opened up the rich culture of the Arab world to Europeans: science, philosophy, literature, and medicine. Many books previously unknown in Europe were translated into Latin: the works of Aristotle, the works of Arab doctors and philosophers. This had a huge impact on scholasticism and later on the Renaissance. Architecture and military affairs also experienced the influence of the East. The Crusades brought new types of fortifications, siege techniques, and fortification ideas to Europe. Elements of Eastern decor began to appear in architecture: arches, domes, and patterned mosaics. The Crusades strengthened the role of the papacy. For the first time in a long time, the Pope was able to unite most Western European rulers around a common goal. The idea of a holy war became a political tool, and the experience of organizing crusades was later used in religious conflicts within Europe. However, the Crusades also left a negative mark. Mutual hatred between Christians and Muslims intensified. In Europe, persecution of Jews, who were associated with the enemies of Christ, increased. In the East, the Crusader states became an incentive for Muslim rulers to unite. Leaders such as Saladin emerged, who were able to create powerful coalitions and regain their lands. The Crusades changed the balance of power. The Byzantine Empire weakened, and the East began to adapt to new threats by developing diplomatic ties and military technology. The Crusades had a multifaceted impact on the history of Europe and the East. Although most of the campaigns did not achieve their long-term military goal of keeping the Holy Land under Christian rule, their consequences were enormous. In the West, monarchies and the papacy grew stronger. The organization of the Crusades showed that Europe could mobilize large forces under a single banner. Many kings gained experience in conducting international expeditions, and military administration and diplomacy improved. In the East, the Crusader states became a catalyst for the unification of Muslim rulers. Leaders such as Saladin were able to form coalitions which strengthened Islamic states and paved the way for future political unions. The Crusades accelerated the development of trade. Italian cities became centers of international commerce. Eastern goods, technologies, new methods of accounting, shipbuilding, and navigation came to Europe. Trade stimulated the growth of cities, strengthened the economy, and formed new social classes: merchants, bankers, and artisans. Contacts with the Muslim East brought scientific and philosophical knowledge to Europe. The works of Aristotle, medical and mathematical research, and the works of Arab philosophers were translated. This became one of the factors that later led to the Renaissance. Europe also adopted elements of Eastern architecture, art, military affairs, and agriculture. Social and religious consequences. The Crusades strengthened the role of religion in society. The idea of a holy war became an instrument of political influence. However, the growth of fanaticism and prejudice led to the persecution of Jews and other minorities, as well as bloody clashes with Muslims. Final significance. The Crusades cannot be considered unequivocally successful in terms of territorial conquest. The Christian states in the East fell by the end of the 13th century, but they left their mark on the history of Europe and the East for many centuries. They accelerated the development of trade and the economy, contributed to cultural and scientific exchange, strengthened international ties, and influenced the formation of European identity and statehood. Thus, the Crusades became not only military expeditions, but also an important historical process that changed the face of medieval Europe and left a legacy that was felt throughout the following millennium.